What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Finance Simplified, the official podcast for Street Fins. We're here to break down the world of finance for you to understand from a relatable perspective with discussions with experts. This is episode 24, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex Patel. How's life been since our last episode?
Hey Rohan, I've been doing well. Just finished up school, so I'm enjoying some time off.
Glad to hear it. I've been out here in LA for a few weeks now, and so far, I'm enjoying it. Everything should be opening up officially soon, so there's going to be lots of things to explore.
That's awesome. I'm hoping to make a trip down there sometime this summer. Maybe we'll record an episode in person.
That would be amazing. Also, since this is the second episode of the month, we'll be opening up our calendars to meet with our listeners individually. If you want to meet with me and Alex for 15 to 30 minutes to talk about the podcast, finance, or just life in general, head down to the Calendly link in the description and find a time that works for you. We look forward to meeting and getting to know you in person.
We also want to remind you to follow us on social media at StreetFins on Twitter and Instagram for updates, and to sign up for our newsletter Finance Simplified for simplified weekly recaps, finance tips, and updates about the podcast. Links are in the description.
So Alex, this is part 2 of our conversation with USC Marshall Dean Geoffrey Garrett on the topic of simplifying business education. What did we talk about in part 1?
So in part 1, we got to learn the basics of business education, differences between undergrad and MBA, and much more.
We'll be getting more into the impact of COVID-19 on business education, Dr. Garrett's thoughts on the future of globalization and business education, and much more. But before we continue, we just want to remind you that if you are learning from our episodes and want to keep supporting what we're doing, we'd be eternally grateful if you gave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Even if you're listening to this on another platform, as long as you have an Apple account or device, you can support us with the rating. Additionally, we'd love to know what feedback you have for us, so fill out the feedback form in the description to let us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see from us going forward. Also, stay tuned till the very end of our episode because we'll be teasing out our next episode's guest. The first person to send us an email with the correct guest will get a shout out. Now, let's continue simplifying business education. From the minds of the students at StreetFins, this is Finance Simplified, the podcast that simplifies the seemingly complex and confusing world of money. I'm your host, Rohan Gupta. Yeah, a lot of great points brought up there. And, the crisis of the MBA, that's something we were hoping to talk to you about as well. And you gave your thoughts very well on that. And it's interesting you mentioned like this counter-cyclical nature. Before we started recording, we were talking about our friend Howard Marks, and he went to business school like 1 or 2 years after he graduated from Wharton. And now I'm talking to some of my friends who are seniors right now at USC Marshall or other parts, and they're also thinking about just getting their MBA, reinvesting in their skills because the COVID-19 market has been not the best for hiring, of course. So it does kind of seem like there's some kind of cyclical nature there too. One of the other questions I had is with the latest trends, right? So I just mentioned COVID-19. What about business education has been affected? I just mentioned there might be more like demand to get MBAs earlier, especially for these graduates, class of 2020 graduates. So do you see any other aspects of business education being impacted because of COVID-19? Is there anything you think an undergrad or an MBA program need, like in-person learning? Just any thoughts on the COVID-19 effects on trends in the business education kind of world?
So again, really big and important question. My overall perspective on the pandemic is not an unusual one. I think the pandemic is mostly accelerating trends that were already there. So let me talk about 3 where business education is concerned. First is just the use of technology. I think we used to think that online and on campus were 2 distinct universes. That was probably never really true, but it's not going to be true post-pandemic. We're going to use technology in everything, but I don't think that's going to make in-person less valuable. I think it actually can make it much more valuable. So it's not an online or on-campus dichotomy. It's a hybrid world. And I think the opportunity for us is just to leverage technology to make an on-campus education even more valuable. The second thing I'd mention is the concept of lifelong learning, which I think has already always been there, but is going to become more pronounced. So what do I mean by that? I think degrees are absolutely foundational. The stuff that you're both learning in college is going to stay with you for the rest of your lives. But on the other hand, we know that the world of work that you're going to be in is going to continue to change at a dramatically fast pace, and that today we can't anticipate what the jobs of the future are going to look like. I think that creates both a responsibility and an opportunity for us to be there for our students throughout their careers. So lifelong learning. Now, so yes, I think it should be part of our value proposition with our alumni that we're there for you throughout your careers. But of course, it's also an opportunity for business schools to expand the tent and to provide non-degree education beyond MBA, beyond undergraduate, in ways that are going to be valuable in the market. You know, the challenge for universities there is that anyone can provide non-degree education. So we're competing with all the edtech startups, we're competing with consulting firms to provide a continuous development, upskilling for people. But I think that, I think that's great. I mean, so degrees are foundational, but learning is lifelong. That's a really big trend. And the last thing, you've asked a bit about specialization, and I think we should add this to the equation, which is that certainly at Marshall and at most business schools, the BBA degree and the MBA degree, you've rightly said, are kind of generalist degrees, but we see enormous demand for specialized degrees now at the master's level. So at Marshall, we have a whole suite of master's programs, MS programs. I'll only talk about one because it's close to both of your interests. Our Master's of Business Analytics is an incredibly successful degree precisely because lots of people know that they need the skill set, which is the intersection of information technology and business. And frankly, one of the challenges for us is how do we describe that? Sometimes we talk about business analytics, sometimes we talk about data science for business, sometimes we talk about artificial intelligence. All of those things are really key, and you can't get in-depth focus on any of that stuff in a generalist degree like an MBA or a BBA. So we see incredible demand for our specialized master's programs as well. That was true pre-pandemic. I think it's going to be stronger post.
So, Dr. Garrett, I want to pivot a little bit actually to maybe your specialization, which is globalization. And, one question some of our listeners were wondering is, how do you see globalization affecting international business relations in the coming future?
Yeah, really big topic, Alex. So let me just, at the start, I'll try not to say too much here, and then we can do follow-ups. But I think we are likely entering de-globalizing period. That was true pre-pandemic, but I think the pandemic has accelerated the deglobalization instinct to bring things back home. You just think about supply chains, right? We were worried that masks, we need a shorter supply chain for masks. We need a shorter supply chain for drugs. Now countries are hoarding their vaccines and not wanting to export them. So I think we're probably, after 35 years where there was just more and more and more globalization, I think we've had a kind of peak globalization, and it's probably going to reverse a little bit. So that'd be point one. Point two, the biggest element of that is US-China, where the geopolitical rivalry between the two countries is coming to be more powerful than the economic complementarity between the US and China, which I think has been a really big driver of economic growth, not only in China and the US, but around the world for the past 20 years. So US-China relations are just becoming more geopolitical, more about strategic competition and less about complementarities. What does that mean for the world of business? I think global business is going to continue, but things are going to get a little closer to home markets, and direct US-China is going to be more challenging. So just look at a country that's booming right now, Vietnam. Why would Vietnam be booming? I think Vietnam booms because it's a supply chain alternative to China that's right next to the Chinese market. I think similarly, there are real opportunities for Mexico going forward for a similar reason. A lot of stuff that maybe we would historically have done in China, we now will want to do closer to the US, and there's nowhere that's closer to the US than Mexico. So I think there are going to be great opportunities for global business, but it's not going to look the way it has looked in the last 20 years. And I actually think that's going to require business leaders to have a much subtler understanding of geopolitics, because you can't just have an economic efficiency mindset to how you go global anymore. You've got to understand geopolitical realities and context in a whole range of countries. So a difficult time for global, but I think if you get it right, the upside is going to be incredibly high.
Yeah, and it's really cool that we're listening to you kind of talk about globalization, both this semester and last semester. In my kind of freshman required classes, I'm taking classes centered around globalism. This year, my professor is the former chair of the U.S. National Intelligence Committee, and we're just talking about things like U.S.-China relations, but also looking at all these different parts of the world and the idea of international business, what the impacts are, also like the history leading up to them. Those have been just fascinating to learn about. So yeah, thanks again for sharing your thoughts on the more kind of modern viewpoint you have on that.
So Rohan, can I interrupt you there just to give a little historical context, because I've lived this. I think that if you go back in time to ancient history, which is really the 1990s, in the 1990s, two remarkable things happened. The Cold War ended and most of the world became democratic. And at the same time, markets became global. So that was a decade in which it was very easy, particularly in the US, to kind of say we won, right? Markets and democracy, those were the two most powerful forces in the world. That had a big impact, I think, on business education, because we sort of went with a universalism that business principles were globally applicable. If you then think about the last 20 years, beginning with 9/11, then the financial crisis, and now the pandemic, I think what we now understand is that even if business principles are global, they play out very differently in different parts of the world. And if you're going to be successful, you need an appreciation of both. You need to understand the core universal business principles, but you also need to understand not only why India is different from the US, but why India is different from China. And I think what it's just telling us is that I keep using the word context, which I think is so important. Yes, there are universal business principles, but context really matters. And people who are going to succeed in global business going forward are going to have both. They're going to understand how business works, but they're also going to understand that business works differently in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And so I guess moving on to another kind of section of questions is, you're the dean at Marshall now, you're previously the dean at Wharton. So we just want to kind of know, what was your experience like at Wharton, and what kind of, prompted your decision to leave Wharton and move to USC?
Multi-dimensional question. Look, let me start with the great similarity between Wharton and the Marshall School, which is that both of those business schools are very central to the university, Wharton to Penn and Marshall to USC. And I think the core reason for that is that both schools educate about 20% of undergraduates in both schools. So yes, both Marshall and Wharton have very large graduate programs that are great, but they also have this core similarity that they're very big players in undergraduate, which makes them very central to the university. And Alex, for example, as you know, that's not true at Stanford. Stanford Graduate School of Business is an incredible place, but it's not in the undergraduate curriculum at Stanford. The same is true, to take another iconic school, Harvard Business School, right? Harvard Business School is an incredible place, no undergraduate. So the biggest similarity between Marshall and Wharton is actually one that I've come to value personally, which is, on the one hand, being an undergraduate, which I think is great. And on the other hand, being in undergraduate education means that you're central to the university, you're not peripheral to the university. So that's the biggest similarity. The biggest difference is location, right? I mean, Wharton's in Philadelphia. The path from Philadelphia to Manhattan is really well worn for Wharton students, and that means that a lot of them think about consulting and finance. USC is in California, and it's in Southern California, which is the creative capital of the world. That really changes the context. And for me, look, it was an incredible honor for me to be dean of the Wharton School, but it's also a really exciting opportunity to be dean of Marshall. I mean, just think about what LA means to the world. Not only is Southern California in the top 10 economies in the world, but LA is arguably the most global city in the world. It's the center of the creative economy, and it's the gateway to Asia. And if you're thinking about opportunities for business and for business schools, having all of that is an incredible plus. And, that's not only out there in the world of Los Angeles and Southern California and all of California, it's on campus at USC. I already mentioned that we have this great program with the film school at USC. We're thinking about doing similar things with the Annenberg School, a communication school, which is arguably the top school of its type in the world too. The opportunities that I had at Wharton were just extraordinary ones, no question about it. But I see equally extraordinary opportunities and quite different ones for Marshall because of its location within USC and because of its location in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of view Wharton as like one of those finance feeder schools, right? Like it has a huge history of just, producing a lot of great people who have gone on to become Wall Street legends. And I'm just talking about one kind of, I guess, stereotype of Wharton, I might think. But I'm still in touch with Marshall, even though I don't study there. But I've just seen like this huge kind of push towards entrepreneurship, kind of what Philadelphia and Manhattan have is kind of what LA, Silicon Valley have. And LA itself is becoming such a great startup scene, driven in large part by these people who go through USC, go to Marshall. So one question I wanted to ask is, between your Wharton tenure and your current Marshall tenure, is there just like an overarching philosophy that you apply as a dean? Just kind of any broad philosophy that you applied towards just managing the role or managing kind of the future and where you kind of want to push the school towards?
Well, I think that the one word answer for me would be curiosity. I'm just always curious about what's going on and what we can do better. So maybe it'd be those two, curiosity plus continuous improvement is certainly the way that, I try to lead my life personally and as a leader of the school. Can I just underscore something you said, Rohan, before that I think is really important about Southern California, which is that Silicon Beach is more than a name. It's a reality. And I think the reason it's a reality is because technology, the relationship between technology and creators and creative people is really revolutionary. And that revolution is happening more in LA than anywhere else in the world, right? Because of the history with Hollywood and everything that goes with that. I mean, the creative side and the creator side in LA is just dramatic. And so that's been magnetic for tech talent from the Bay Area. So that's the new face of the LA economy. But you mentioned the other side, which is also maybe paradoxical to many people because LA is such a big city, but LA isn't a city of corporate headquarters. It's a city of entrepreneurs as an economy. And that does, both of those things, the kind of creative economy and the fact that LA is such an entrepreneurial city, of course, that creates opportunities for us in the business school that we've got to take advantage of and make contributions to. And I hope we're doing that.
Yeah, and I'd love to sort of get your perspective on the future of business education and, to sort of set the stage. What are some of the factors you see significantly affecting the business education in the next 10 years or 100 years? And do you see really trends in tech and automation changing what is taught in business as, there's multiple reports suggesting 20, 30, 40% of the workforce could be ultimately replaced by AI and automation?
Alex, you ask big questions. So I think, this was true of the speech President Biden gave recently on why he wants to invest more in education. I think education is the core solution to the concerns about the future of work in an age of digital disruption. We want people who can take advantage of and who can leverage technology, not be intimidated by it or made outmoded by it. So, it's easy for me to say I'm in higher ed, but I do think more and better education is the right human response to advances in technology like AI. What's that mean for business schools? As I've said already, the business schools today need people both who are very comfortable technically, but who also are very human, are really good at empathy, compassion, being self-aware, understanding what it takes to lead. So that's a 1-2 punch. But I think if we're going to add a third one to that, make it a 1-2-3 punch. I think I saw this from McKinsey recently. They're talking about IQ, which we can, in this context, let's call that technical skills. Then they're talking about EQ, let's call that leadership. The third one they're now floating is AQ. And the A stands for adaptability, right? We're living in a world, I think, that's characterized by both unprecedented uncertainty and about unprecedentedly fast change. And so we're all just going to have to become more adaptable. And I think business schools are in a good place to rise to that adaptability challenge because we understand this interplay between core principles and how they work in the real world. And it's a two-way interplay. So I think that you could view the next decade and longer as being intimidating ones. It's really uncertain. There seem to be lots of challenges. I tend to take the glass half full, or maybe much more than half full approach to this, which is, yes, there's going to be an enormous amount of disruption, but the disruption is going to create opportunities, and opportunities that I think are transformative, not only for individuals, but also for humanity. And, let me say something you didn't ask. I think the distinctive feature of your generation is just how mission-driven, purpose-oriented, impact-obsessed you all are. And I think that's just fantastic, right? So you don't only want to get a good job that gives you a good standard of living. You want to work for organizations you admire. If you're an entrepreneur, you want to change the world and you want to make the world a better place. I think the fundamental opportunity for business schools is to harness all that and to help you get there. So, yeah, look, the pace of change isn't slowing down, it's speeding up. Predicting the future is harder than ever before. But I think it's just an incredibly exciting time at the same moment, and a fantastic time to be leading a great business school. So I'm a very lucky person.
Yeah. And with that, we're going to ask our final question. And it's something I ask all my guests if they have children. I ask them this as their final question. So knowing what you know about business, finance, the globalization, technology, all these things that we've talked about today, what lessons have you given your children and just students about the world of money and the world of business?
So my answer, Rohan, again, is a very macro one. So I think the biggest lesson for me is that no matter what social problems we have, it's easier to deal with them if the pie is expanding. So rather than thinking first about how to distribute stuff, which is what politics tends to do, I think we should first think about how do we expand the pie. And if you're going to think about expanding the pie, I think almost all of the dramatic changes have been by private sector innovation. So, my daughter, who was a liberal arts undergraduate, is now working in finance. And, we don't talk about the details of how you do deals and what the spreadsheets and models look like. We talk much more about the role of finance in making things possible that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So the big lesson for me is, again, it's why I got into business schools. I think the role of the private sector is bigger and bigger. The ultimate role of the private sector is to expand the pie. And if the pie is expanding, it makes the distributive things that we think about all the time, it just makes them a little bit easier. So, I think I'd say to my daughter, I'd say to anybody who's listening, go into business not only because it's going to create a good, potentially very good paycheck for you and a good career. Go into business because it's going to make the world a better place. And if you think about those two things at the same time, what is what I'm doing meaning for me, materially in terms of my quality of life, but also what's it mean to me in terms of my contribution to society? If you think about both those things at the same time, I think you're going to lead a life that's going to be really, really fulfilling. And as I said, I think the opportunities are incredible. Even amid all the disruption, the pace of change, the uncertainty, everything else, the opportunities are still there. And if you as business people do a good job, you're not only going to lead good lives, nice lives personally, you're going to help change the world and make it a better place. And what could be more important than that?
Well, with that, Dr. Garrett, we would just want to thank you for your time. And it was a real treat, especially for me, given that, I go to USC. It was a real treat to have you on the podcast, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
Pleasure was all mine. And thanks a million for your doing this. It's a really great program.
Hey everyone, that was the end of part 2 of our 2-part interview with Geoffrey Garrett on simplifying business education. We hope you enjoyed and learned more about business education from him. The entire conversation was amazing. Alex, what were some of the key takeaways from the second part?
It was really interesting to hear about Dr. Garrett's thoughts on the impact of COVID-19 on business education. I'm certainly interested to see if the hybrid model is preserved and whether or not there are lasting changes in MBA programs.
I also agree with the sentiment that we are entering a deglobalizing period, but that still doesn't mean that a global focus on business is irrelevant. In fact, it might be even more relevant because now we have to understand the intricacies of each country to understand how to conduct business there.
Yep, and I also think it's important to reiterate that the biggest part of that deglobalization is US-China relations, which we'll probably end up doing an episode on sometime in the future. Additionally, hearing about how Dr. Garrett approaches his deanship at USC and how it's similar and different from his tenure at Wharton was also pretty fascinating.
Agreed. Well, Alex, that wraps up our part 2 conversation and takeaways. And now it's time for us to tease the next episode's guests. Remember, the first person who sends an email to us at fspodcast@streetfins.com with the correct guess will get a shout out in the next episode. So here are the 2 hints for our next guest. Number 1, she's a former poker world champion. And number 2, she's written several books on being a better decision maker. The next episode will be out on July 1st, so we'll talk to you all then. Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. It truly means the world to us. If you like this episode and others, let us know by subscribing and giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and following us on Spotify. Share us with your friends and check us out on Instagram and Twitter, both @StreetFins. You can also follow me on Twitter @RohanInvest. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please email fspodcast@streetfins.com. Thanks once again to Dr. Geoffrey Garrett for his insights today. I hope you understand the topic of business education in a more simplified way. Once again, we're really happy that you're taking the initiative to learn finance and to better your future. If you haven't already, we highly encourage you to check out streetfins.com for articles, videos, and other content. Join the StreetFins community and tell your friends about us so that they can learn about finance too. We'll talk to you next time on Finance Simplified.